Welcome to Martin Survival. So what I thought we would do in this series is show you how to make traditional hunting arrows. Now, before on my YouTube channel, I did show you how to make a very basic arrow. There's really not a lot going on there. It's very, very simple with the exception of the fletching and of course the napping. But constructing the arrow is for the most part very easy. Now when you start getting into the more advanced arrows, adding a foreshaft, that's where a lot of complexity goes into. There's a lot of physics, there's a lot of science, and there's a lot of understanding in the native culture and how the hunter-gatherer used to live off of the land, not only here but all over the United States and all over the world. So in this series I am going to show you how to make an arrow with a removable foreshaft. So stick around, we got a great show coming up. Alright, so welcome back. Now the first thing I want to go over is a very common question that I receive from beginners that are just starting to get into arrow making, bow making, and primitive technology. And that is, why use and why go through all the trouble of making a foreshaft and inserting that into a tail shaft? And it's quite obvious. The reason is we sure as hell don't want to skip out on meat and precious valuable food when sustaining ourselves. As well as our family. We want to make sure that we're as humane as possible as well. See, what happens is when we just insert a stone point or sharpen the tip and start tapering it off on this tail shaft, as soon as it hits the animal's body and inserts into the creature, that creature's adrenaline immediately kicks in and starts going into full effect, and it'll start brushing up against vegetation. It'll take off. It'll brush up against these Joshua trees that are behind me if you're in the pine country, against different oaks and pines and different scrub brush. And ultimately, that'll knock the shaft out of its body, and we just injured the animal at that point, and it starts going into suffering. And that's not good at all. We want to make sure that we're as humane as possible, and even within doing such a cruel act such as hunting, but it's absolutely needed. For ultimately wilderness living and self-reliance out here. So what happens with a foreshaft is, right as this hunting arrow hits the creature's body, the tail shaft immediately releases and the foreshaft is inserted into the creature's body. Then we can start tracking the blood and ultimately finding our kill. So this is a very humane way to hunt and secure tools and meat for ourselves along with our family. It's just something that should be considered when hunting and living off of the land in a primitive way. This is what a lot of cultures and a lot of tribes out in the West would use, compared to just a stone point lashed onto a shaft like we normally see in different gift shops. So this is a very, very efficient way of hunting. Now I want to take the time in right now going over materials and talking about the differences between these two arrows you see right here. First of all, you can see I have a couple different traditional patterns up top. You can see the bottom arrow has a Paiute replica paint pattern up by the fletching, and this top arrow has just another traditional pattern. I didn't really base that top arrow off of anything. I just kind of thought of it and jotted it down and started creating it. So going over this one right here, you can see that this has a wooden foreshaft. It has a black obsidian Ishi style point. This is arrowweed. It's all been heat treated. And we have leg sinew wrapped with, I think I used hide glue on this, and I used mule fat for the shaft. Turkey feathers up top, once again hide glue, and I actually used, looks like on this arrow I used artificial sinew. I did not use backstrap sinew. And I started gluing those feathers down. I wrapped it from the bottom, and I started wrapping up top, and about an hour, 2 hours later, I actually unroll the wrap, and we'll go over that during the arrow making process. Once again, turkey feathers. We want to stay away from hawks and eagles. Traditionally, that was what was used out here and throughout the West and throughout America is hawks and eagles. There was a lot of meaning behind that. But unfortunately, as I've said before, it is illegal, and they are federally protected. So we want to make sure we take the legal route. Turkey feathers work extremely well. This one right here it has a wooden foreshaft, as you can see, and this is what was typically used on the West Coast. And I think these wooden foreshafts are highly overlooked. They were extremely efficient. And my buddy Tony Soares and I got together yesterday, and I actually tested this arrow out, and this does extremely well. And the penetration actually went down to about right here on a decoy deer. It has a tremendous amount of impact. It's very deadly, very violent, and very efficient. And once again, we have that removable foreshaft. It's been heat treated, sealed with acrylic red paint, and I'm fully confident that this wooden foreshaft would take down a mule deer, a fox, a bighorn sheep, mountain lion, coyote out in my area. This is a very efficient way to hunt with, and we still have that forward weight because that arrowweed is such a dense material. We have leg sinew, and then and I have a little bit of hide glue sealing that down. We want to make sure we use an animal byproduct. When doing so, it mixes well with the sinew. This is backstrap sinew fletched. So once again, I repeated the same pattern, just using a natural material for the fletching or for the wrap, excuse me, and of course turkey feathers with that beautiful Paiute pattern. So now let's go into different foreshafts that we can use when hunting. This one right here is a very short foreshaft. It doesn't have a lot of weight to it. This one is, once again, arrowweed, has a heat treat on it, an acrylic pattern. Once again, we have that Paiute pattern on it. And this is very small. This would be typically used for different larger birds. I can use this for coyote, fox, jackrabbit. This will be no problem. With deer, I want a little bit more weight on it. And something like this would come in handy. Once again, we have a nice sharp black obsidian point up top, and we have a heat treated arrowweed with an acrylic paint, and same thing with this one. This one has quite a bit of weight too, even though it's a smaller stone for the tip. And all of these are wrapped with backstrap sinew. So those are a few different foreshaft options that we can use. Now getting into the shaft and the foreshaft that was used traditionally in California and throughout the West Coast. Now the Gabrielino, that's farther west into the Los Angeles mountains, in traditional times they would use this. This is mule fat. This is a light wood, but it's not as light as the cane that we're going to go over in just a second. So this is going to have a tremendous amount of speed. Like I said, the Gabrielino would use these as short arrows with shorter bows, and this would offer a tremendous amount of speed once again. And this is what we are going to use in this series, and demonstrating and showing you guys how to make a traditional hunting arrow. This right here is arrow weed. This is what I will use for the foreshaft, and I find that this is a very, very good combination when making a hunting arrow, is having a light shaft with a nice hard dense wood. This has a nice tight growth ring for the foreshaft, so I have the speed, but I also have that drive and that tremendous amount of impact in the foreshaft. So when it inserts into the animal, this is a really hard dense wood. Like I said, a lot of the Mojaves towards the Colorado River farther east from here would use this arrow weed. This is what they would prefer. Once again, very, very dense hard wood. The Mojave Indians were one of the most warlike tribes in California. They were a very, very brutal tribe, and they were known for that. They were very skilled in the land, but you don't want to mess with them back in traditional times. Very, very tough tribe. So we also see different Cahuilla examples. I do believe Serrano and Chemehuevi that were out here would use this as well. The Malki Museum has some excellent artifacts and excellent examples of arrowweed being used. Then what we would see a lot of the times in the West Coast would be this right here. This is a native reed. This is a California native reed. This is very, very light. I mean, it's even lighter than the mule fat, like I said. So on a calm, non-windy day, this is going to cut through the atmosphere. It's going to offer the most speed out of any of these arrows that I have made. This was typically used in the West Coast. This is just some very, very fast stuff, very light material, but it's also very difficult to heat treat and start straightening this. You have to use a stone with a groove cut through the center to do so. If you scorch this wood, as soon as it hits the target or hits the animal, it's going to crack if it's scorched. So we want to make sure we do this right. We want to take our time when straightening this, and I always recommend, when just beginning, gather twice as much as you planned on gathering. The reason is with the heat treating, I learned myself, you'll break about half of them to a quarter. So you want to make sure you gather about twice as much. And once you start working on a good dozen of these arrows, you'll finally start getting the feel of straightening that out. So with a vise, we want to plant it into the fire, get that nice and hot. We want to remove the stone, and right here we have a little bit of a bend. So we want to place it into that groove, and we want to start slowly working the wood. And once again, each shaft, it takes a while. It's definitely a patience game, but you come out with a very fast, straight product. And once again, a lot of Indian cultures knew that, and they would use it. So without further ado, I want to take you through the process of burnishing the wood, and we'll start getting into making and shaping out the foreshaft as well as the tail shaft. So stick around.